I am thrilled that we're able to kick off our in-person Trust Talks with such a fantastic speaker, Lee Pollock. I want to be able to thank the Kilcollins for getting me here. So with that, I think the speaker's records tells you everything you need to know. Lee's a native of Montreal, got his undergraduate degree from McGill University, his master's from the University of Chicago, and he's been founding board member and executive director in the past of the Winston Churchill Society, lots of publications, TV presentations, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee and let him tell the rest of the story. Thank you, Lee, for being here.
Thank you, Chris, for that nice introduction, and I'll add to his comment. Thank you to Rick and Wendy Kilcullen, our dear longtime friends from Chicago, for inviting us down here. It's wonderful in life to have great friends in a place you live most of your life, and then when they come to a magical place like Spring Island, it's doubly enjoyable. So wonderful to be here. Winston Churchill's not here tonight, but he does have a, he sends his apologies. But he does have a South Carolina connection. One of his, perhaps his greatest long-standing American friend was the financier and advisor to President Bernard Baruch, a native of South Carolina. And Baruch, for many years, owned a magnificent 16,000-acre estate called Hobcob Barony, north of Charleston. It's open to the public today. Winston Churchill enjoyed visiting that, and I suspect if he were around, he would find Spring Island equally fascinating and enjoyable. So perhaps he'll get here next year. So on to the story of Winston Churchill, American hero. That story begins on a date that lives in history and in infamy, December 7th, 1941. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for just a year and a half. On the day he took office, May 10th, 1940, the Nazi juggernaut invaded France, Holland, and Belgium, advancing with astonishing speed. Amazingly, just 6 weeks later, the mighty French army surrendered to Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht. Churchill was spending that Sunday evening at this place, Chequers, the official country residence of the British Prime Minister, some 40 miles outside of London. His guests that evening included his daughter-in-law, Pamela Churchill, the new American ambassador, Gil Winant, who had replaced the discredited Joseph P. Kennedy, and most importantly, President Roosevelt's personal envoy, Averell Harriman. Pamela Churchill and Averell Harriman had a relationship of their own, but that's another story. And most importantly, Winston Churchill had grown close to both Harriman and Winant, whose positive reports back to Washington were highly valuable to the British cause. At 9 p.m. that evening, Churchill and his guests turned on the radio to listen to the evening news. At the end of the broadcast, there was a short sentence about a Japanese attack on America. Churchill bolted up, not fully understanding what he had heard. Then his butler rushed into the room and exclaimed, "It's quite true. We heard it for ourselves outside. The Japanese have attacked Hawaii." Ambassador Winant quickly called the White House, and Churchill took the phone. "Mr. President," he said, "what's this about Pearl Harbor?" "It's true," Roosevelt replied. "They have attacked us. We are all in the same boat now." Churchill later described his feelings that evening, knowing that the alliance with the United States, which he had so long sought, was finally reality. He wrote, "So we had won after all. After months of lonely fighting, Britain would live. Once again in our Long Island history, we would emerge safe and victorious." And then he continued, "Being saturated with emotion, I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." That December day in 1941 was a singular moment in Winston Churchill's long relationship with the American people. But it was only one part of a long and deep connection. That connection began with his mother, a celebrated and beautiful New York heiress named Jenny Jerome, born in Brooklyn in 1854, the son of this man, Leonard Jerome, then one of the leading financiers in the country, and his beautiful wife, Clarissa. Leonard was known as the King of Wall Street, and among his many investments was part ownership of the New York Times, then one of the leading Republican newspapers in the country. I think it is less Republican today. Jenny's son, Winston, was raised in England, but was proud of his American ancestry. He was especially pleased that 3 of his forebears had fought in the Revolutionary War against the British. He took additional pleasure in a family tradition, never fully proven, that another ancestor was an Iroquois Indian. Jenny married Lord Randolph Churchill, the 3rd son of the Duke of Marlborough, at age 20 in April 1874. And although Churchill was raised in Britain, the America of his mother's birth was never far from his mind, even at a young age. When only 13, his birthday request was for a copy of General Grant's newly published memoir of the Civil War, which had ended only 9 years before Winston's birth. After graduating from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and entering the Army, Winston Churchill was ready to see the world. In November 1895, when he was just 20, he eagerly embraced his first opportunity to visit America. He wangled an invitation to visit the Cuban uprising against Spanish rule and stopped in New York on his way to Havana. He stayed with one of his mother's close American friends, this man, Burr Cochran. Cochran was a celebrated member of Congress and a captivating orator who became an important mentor to the young Winston and a major influence on Winston's own developing rhetoric. Churchill embraced America, but he was also perplexed by it. He wrote the following in a letter to his mother: "My mind is full of irreconcilable and conflicting facts. The hospitality of American society and the vulgarity of its press present to me a problem of great complexity." But his overall verdict was positive, and he said, "Picture yourself, the American people, as a great lusty youth who treads on all your sensibilities and perpetrates every horror of ill manners, but who moves about his efforts with a good-hearted freshness which may well be the envy of the older nations of the world." Churchill's next visit, 5 years later, in December 1900, came under different circumstances. In the preceding 5 years, he had made his mark as a soldier, war correspondent, author, and rising young politician. His escape from the Boers in South Africa made Churchill a war hero and secured him a seat in Parliament just a month before he set out for the United States. This visit had a particular purpose. As Churchill noted, quote, "I pursue profit, not pleasure, in the States this time." The profit was from paid speeches, and Churchill spent 7 weeks barnstorming from one city to another, often facing crowds suspicious of his defense of the British Empire, in particular of the Boer War and British rule over Ireland. Churchill's tour agent arranged a speech at the Waldorf Astoria, where Churchill was introduced by America's most famous author, the 65-year-old Mark Twain. Twain apparently took a liking to his young visitor, saying, quote, "Mr. Churchill, by his father, is an Englishman. By his mother, he is an American. No doubt a blend that makes the perfect man." Twain went on to condemn Britain's war in South Africa, as well as America's conquest of the Philippines, but then he added, quote, "England and America, we are kin. And now that we are kin in sin, there is nothing more to be desired." That harmony is perfect, just like Mr. Churchill himself. Winston Churchill sailed home from America on February 1st, 1901. As it turned out, it was his last time on American shores for 28 years. Churchill took his newly won seat in Parliament on his return from America and remained a member for almost all of the next 63 years. The decades that followed Churchill's visit to America were highly eventful. In 1904, he abandoned his father's Conservative Party and crossed the floor to sit as a Liberal. Just 7 years later, in 1911, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, a civilian head of the Royal Navy, which was the vital lifeline of Britain and its empire. For Winston Churchill, the First World War witnessed a spectacular fall from power after the failure of the Dardanelles campaign in Turkey. He was forced out of the cabinet, and thinking his political career was over, he went on active duty as a soldier, serving at the front in Belgium. His wife, Clementine, said at this time, "I thought he would die of grief." But Churchill returned to government just 2 years later as a highly successful Minister of Munitions, then as Secretary for War and for the Colonies. By the early 1920s, Churchill's Liberal Party had lost most of its power, and he was forced to return to the Tories, many of whose leaders distrusted him for years after. He described his about-face by saying, "Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat." And then in November 1924, the new Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin surprised Churchill with his highest office yet, Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second most powerful position in the government. Churchill continued as Chancellor until June 1929, when the Conservatives were defeated in that year's general election. Less than 6 months later, the Wall Street crash marked the beginning of a global collapse, both economic and political. And while Churchill did not visit the United States again for almost 30 years, he recognized that close relations with America were essential to Britain's future. During the First World War, he worked closely with American figures such as Bernard Baruch, who was president of the U.S. War Industries Board, and General John Pershing. But despite Churchill's admiration for what he called the Great Republic, friction between the two countries became pronounced in the 1920s. America's retreat into isolationism and its failure to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and support the League of Nations were a blow to Churchill's desire for a more cooperative world order. Disputes arose about British war debts to the United States and America's insistence on being paid in full. As one isolationist senator said, "Well, they hired the money, didn't they?" Churchill publicly and unwisely feuded with the powerful American Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. Further controversies arose about the size of the British and American navies, a critical issue for an island nation which still had a vast empire. These disputes became so pronounced that when a suggestion was made later in the 1920s that Churchill move from the Exchequer to the Foreign Secretary's office, his wife Clementine cautioned against it, citing, quote, his well-known anti-American views. After he left the cabinet in 1929, Churchill remained a member of Parliament, but now had time for other things in addition to politics. The result was a 3-month holiday tour of North America, accompanied by his 18-year-old son Randolph and Churchill's younger brother Jack. After several weeks in Canada, the Churchill troop, as Randolph called it, crossed the US border and was confronted with the realities of prohibition. Randolph had stashed bottles of whiskey and brandy in their luggage, but the customs officer looked the other way. He then said, quote, "Mr. Churchill, may I invite you into my office for a drink?" The Churchills then traveled the length and breadth of California and stayed with William Randolph Hearst at his fabulous castle at San Simeon. Churchill met other luminaries, including the London-born actor Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin's left-wing opinions were far from Churchill's, but he liked him nonetheless. He described the great actor as, quote, Bolshevik in politics, but delightful in conversation. The Churchills then headed east for several weeks in New York with a side trip to Washington to meet the new president, Herbert Hoover, and to tour the Civil War battlefields of Virginia. All along the way, Churchill traded feverishly in US stocks, telling Clementine, quote, there is a brokerage office in every hotel. You sit and watch the figures being marked up on slates every few minutes. Churchill successfully doubled and redoubled his bets. E.F. Hutton was his broker. And then reality set in on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929. Churchill ruefully added up his losses. At a dinner in New York hosted by Bernard Baruch, Churchill was toasted by one of the guests who addressed the audience as friends and former millionaires. The coup de grace was Black Tuesday the following week, just as Churchill was preparing to sail home. In a short time, he had lost the entire advance on his next book without having written a single word. But even still, in a newspaper column he wrote a month later, Churchill said the crash had not diminished his abiding faith in America's strength and resilience. 2 years later, Churchill was back in America again, this time with his wife Clementine accompanying him. He undertook a whirlwind tour of 40 paid lectures spread over a dozen cities. His primary subject was the importance of Anglo-American collaboration in a dangerous and volatile world. But fate intervened once again in December 1931, just a few days after Churchill's arrival in New York. On his way in a taxi to visit Bernard Baruch, Churchill forgot his address book and found that many luxury apartment buildings on Fifth Avenue looked the same. Frustrated, he jumped out of the cab, and his British habits got the worst of him. He looked the wrong way and was flattened by an oncoming car traveling at 30 miles an hour. The result was a skull fracture, broken ribs, and other injuries, and it took him over 2 months to recover. But with America still under prohibition, Churchill found a very practical benefit from his accident. His attending physician wrote the following prescription. This is to certify that the convalescence of Winston Churchill necessitates the use of alcoholic spirits, especially at mealtimes. The quantity is naturally indefinite, but the minimum requirements would be 250 cubic centimeters. For those of you who don't want to do the math, that's 8 ounces. I don't know if that was per day or per meal, but you get the idea. Churchill resumed his lecture tour at the end of January, but his central theme, the special link between Britain and America, did not appeal to every listener. The Washington Post commented, quote, not many years ago, unity with the Yankees would have been repulsive to British statesmen. Now the tables are turned, and Mr. Churchill is trying to flatter the United States into taking over some of Britain's liabilities. What contribution has Britain to make to the cooperative bond that Mr. Churchill is offering? In short, America was still deeply divided about its role in the world and its relationship with its former mother country. For the rest of the 1930s, Winston Churchill remained in the political wilderness. His opposition to independence for India and support for King Edward VIII during the abdication crisis served him poorly, and he remained unpopular in the Conservative Party and much of the British establishment. During this time, Churchill frequently met with American visitors, ranging from the famous columnist Walter Lippmann to James Roosevelt, the president's son. After dinner with the young Roosevelt, Churchill was asked, "What is your greatest wish?" he replied, "I wish to be Prime Minister and in close and daily communication by telephone with the President of the United States. There was nothing that we could not do if we were together." And on other occasions, Churchill's view of America was more lighthearted, writing in one magazine essay, quote, "A dangerous yet almost universal habit of the American people is the drinking of immense quantities of ice water." By the time Adolf Hitler occupied the remnant of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, war was inevitable. One of the open questions was, what would America do? The Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, spoke for many when he said, quote, "It is always best and safest to count on nothing from the Americans except words." But with or without the United States, Britain was preparing for war. The Second World War began on September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, Winston Churchill was finally back in the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he had held at the start of the First War 25 years before. Just 9 months later, on May 10th, 1940, Churchill received the commission of King George VI to lead a new government as Prime Minister. As he returned from Buckingham Palace that evening, his car was unusually quiet, and his bodyguard, Inspector Walter Thompson, attempted to break the silence by congratulating his boss on his appointment, but expressing fears about its timeliness. Churchill brooded for a moment and said, quote, "I hope it is not too late. I fear it is, but we can only do our best." But by the time Churchill went to bed at 3 a.m. the next morning, his mood had lightened considerably. He later wrote in one of the most famous passages of his war memoirs, "I was conscious of a profound sense of relief, for at last I had the authority to give direction over the whole scene. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial. I was sure I would not fail." 5 days later, Churchill cabled Franklin Roosevelt with grim news from France, which was facing imminent defeat. Churchill's message reported, "The scene has darkened markedly. We expect to be attacked here in the near future and are getting ready for that. If necessary, we shall continue the war alone, and we are not afraid." But while the Prime Minister attempted to reassure the President of Britain's resolve, he warned of an alternate outcome. "I trust you realize, Mr. President, that the voice and force of the United States may account for nothing if they are withheld too long. You may have a completely subjugated, Nazified Europe established with astonishing speed, and the weight of that may be more than we can bear." Churchill asked Roosevelt for substantial American aid, but the President hesitated. Only limited assistance would be provided, not the desperately needed ships and aircraft. The President was simply unsure of Churchill's leadership and Britain's ability to keep on fighting. The next 12 months were the grimmest, but also the most glorious in British history. Rallied by the rescue of its army at Dunkirk and Churchill's inspiring speeches, the British people won the Battle of Britain, survived the Blitz and the U-boat menace, and narrowly avoided defeat in North Africa. And after FDR decisively won a third term in November 1940, his ability to assist in the defense of Britain was enhanced. The President's closest advisor, Harry Hopkins, spent several weeks in London, and his glowing reports about Churchill favorably impressed the President. After hearing Hopkins' evaluation, Roosevelt sent the Prime Minister a handwritten note, quoting the poet Longfellow, saying, quote, "This verse applies to your people as it does to ours." The Longfellow poem went, "Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate." Churchill replied the next day in a radio broadcast, saying in one of his most famous phrases, "What answer shall I give in your name to this great man, the thrice chosen head of a nation of 130 million? Here is the answer I shall give to President Roosevelt. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." And now it was time for these two men to meet, an encounter that Churchill had been seeking for some time. A secret rendezvous was arranged off the coast of Newfoundland in August. Winston Churchill crossed the Atlantic in the great battleship, the Prince of Wales, dodging U-boat traffic as he went. At their first meeting, he presented a letter to Roosevelt from King George VI, who had visited the president in 1939 at his home in Hyde Park and had his first taste of a great American delicacy, a hot dog. The meeting was a success, and the two men got on well. They issued a statement of war aims known as the Atlantic Charter, which included calls for self-determination for all peoples and free trade. These were difficult subjects for Winston Churchill and the British Empire, and were to be a future source of friction with the new American ally. The highlight of the visit was a joint prayer service on Sunday aboard the Prince of Wales. The Prime Minister personally selected every part of the service to emphasize a common Anglo-American moral and spiritual heritage. And just a few months later, after Pearl Harbor, Britain and America were allies, and Churchill immediately traveled to Washington to begin planning the joint war effort. He stayed as a guest in the White House for almost a month, and he and Roosevelt kept late hours, fueled by the excitement of war and some alcohol. The First Lady, Eleanor, understandably thought that Churchill was a bad influence on her husband. One morning, Churchill had an idea he wanted to one morning, Roosevelt had an idea he wanted to discuss with Churchill and had himself wheeled into the Prime Minister's bedroom. Churchill was just emerging from the bath and his towel dropped to the floor. Embarrassed, Roosevelt said he would return later, but Churchill quickly drew himself up and responded, "But sir, the Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." The high point of Churchill's visit to Washington came the morning after Christmas, when he addressed a joint session of Congress, one of the few non-Americans ever accorded that honor. He knew that this was a chance to present himself to an audience more than a few of whose members, just a few months before, had been staunch opponents of American involvement in the war. Churchill's speech made a phenomenal impact, especially when he began by saying, "If my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I think I might have got here on my own." Churchill concluded his triumphant address with this call to arms: "I vow my faith and hope, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace." When Churchill left Washington after a farewell dinner with Roosevelt and Hopkins on January 14th, the president's parting words were, "Trust me to the bitter end." Winston Churchill knew that this new alliance would bring Britain and America to ultimate victory. In the 4 remaining years of the war, the two leaders communicated with over 2,000 cables and letters and met 7 more times, in Washington, at the president's home in Hyde Park, and in exotic Casablanca. When he and Roosevelt made a side trip from Casablanca to Marrakesh, a place Churchill truly loved, he painted this beautiful picture, which he gave to the president. He painted a beautiful picture which he gave to the president, and the president proudly hung it in his home in Hyde Park. The two leaders were together in Tehran at last with Stalin, and then, perhaps most famously of all, at Yalta. The relationship between these two men flourished, but there were eventually significant changes, much to Churchill's distress. The war became more complex, and the preponderance of the United States' economic and military power became more obvious. There were many disagreements, all eventually resolved, but not without friction and lasting impact. Franklin Roosevelt and the United States had simply become the dominant partner in both the alliance and in their own friendship. Most significantly, Churchill, earlier than Roosevelt, came to distrust Stalin and to fear Soviet expansion into the heart of Europe. Roosevelt's desire to meet privately with Stalin distressed Churchill, first because he resented that he was excluded, and because he worried what concessions the president would make to the Soviet dictator. The big three leaders, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, gathered for the last time at the Levadia Palace in Yalta in February 1945. To some, that meeting was the surrender of Eastern Europe to communist domination. To others, it was the first stirring of Western opposition to Soviet expansion. Sadly, the nations of Eastern Europe became victims and would have to wait another 40 years for the freedom for which Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill waged the Second World War. This part of Winston Churchill's American connection was soon to pass into history. The afternoon of April 12, 1945, while sitting in his study at his home at Warm Springs, Georgia, the president suddenly exclaimed, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," and died of a cerebral hemorrhage. 5 days later, the prime minister addressed a hushed House of Commons. He recounted his meetings with the president and said, "For us it remains only to say that in Franklin Roosevelt there died the greatest American friend we have ever known, and the greatest champion of freedom who has ever brought help and comfort from the new world to the old." But just 3 months later, Winston Churchill was turned out of office in a stunning defeat at the hands of the Labour Party in the first British election since 1935. His wife, Clementine, told him that the defeat might, quote, "be a blessing in disguise," to which he immediately retorted, "At the moment, it seems very effectively disguised." More humorously, asked about reports that the king would honor him with the Order of the Garter, Churchill said, "How can I receive the Order of the Garter when the people have just given me the Order of the Boot?" Early in November 1945, Churchill received an invitation to give a speech at a small, little-known college in Fulton, Missouri. At the bottom was a handwritten note which said, "This is a wonderful school in my home state. Hope you can do it. I'll introduce you." The handwriting was that of the new president, the Missouri-born Harry Truman. Churchill was anxious to maintain his voice in world affairs and his prominence in the United States, especially with Truman at his side, and quickly accepted. The speech was set for March 5th, 1946. Churchill traveled to Fulton on the presidential train with Harry Truman. The two leaders ate, drank, smoked, and played poker almost non-stop. At 2:30 a.m. the next morning, Churchill suddenly put down his cards and said, "If I were to be born again, there is one country in which I would want to be a citizen, a country where a man knows he has an unbounded future." Asked to name the country, he replied, "The USA, even though I deplore some of your customs." Which customs, he was asked. Churchill replied, "You stop drinking with your meals." Churchill's Fulton speech, formerly titled "The Sinews of Peace," was broadcast nationally and caused a sensation. He addressed the great emerging issues of the post-war age and urged America to remain engaged in world affairs and assume a leadership role commensurate with its political, military, and economic strength. He hoped the United States would not retreat into isolationism as it had in the 1920s. In particular, he called for maintaining the Anglo-American bond that had been forged during the war, urging what he called a special relationship between the two nations in the hope that this would secure world peace. That phrase, the special relationship, remains a touchstone of British foreign policy to this day. And most importantly, Churchill sounded a warning with these famous words: "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of Central and Eastern Europe, subject to increasing control from Moscow." Today, of course, the Iron Curtain speech is iconic, but its reception at the time was very mixed. Needless to say, Stalin's view was harsh. He said Churchill's talk amounted to, quote, "a call for war with the Soviet Union." Liberal circles in Britain and America were also critical, leading to the old charge that Winston Churchill was a warmonger. President Truman falsely claimed that he hadn't read the speech beforehand. But more than 70 years later, the verdict of history is clear. As on many great issues, Winston Churchill was right. The Conservative Party narrowly won the British election in October 1951, and Churchill returned for a final term as Prime Minister. As in the past, domestic issues were of less interest to him, but he worried about the destructive power of the new H-bomb. He focused in particular on how Britain and America, with Churchill intending to play a central role, could come to a better understanding with the Soviet Union. He advocated a meeting with the Soviet leadership to be held, quote, "at the summit." It was another Churchill phrase that would stick in history. But President Eisenhower was lukewarm about Churchill's suggestion. While he still respected Churchill for his wartime leadership, Ike and his powerful Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had a more critical view of the Soviet Union. Churchill found Dulles frustrating and supposedly labeled him, quote, "a bull who carries his own china shop around with him." By the time the summit was finally held in July 1955, Churchill had been retired for 3 months. But he continued to believe in that special relationship, and at his last cabinet meeting, his advice to his colleagues was, quote, "never be separated from the Americans." In his last years, Churchill returned to America 2 more times, including a sentimental visit with Eisenhower in Washington in May 1959. A few years later, April 9, 1963, witnessed an unprecedented ceremony in the White House Rose Garden. A few months earlier, the US Congress had granted Churchill honorary American citizenship, the first ever for a foreigner. Poor health prevented Churchill from attending, but he watched on satellite TV from his home in London as President Kennedy signed the proclamation. Among the guests were Abel Harriman, as well as 3 sons of Franklin Roosevelt, and the 92-year-old Bernard Baruch. The family was represented by Winston's son Randolph, and his son, who was also named Winston S. Churchill. Churchill's relationship with the Kennedy family had actually begun many years before. The president's father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., had first visited Churchill at his home in Chartwell in the English countryside in the early 1930s, and the connection grew when Joe Kennedy became ambassador to the court of St. James in 1938. Joe and his wife Rose, along with their 9 rambunctious children, took London by storm. Their second son, Jack, was just 21 and still a student at Harvard. Jack Kennedy's time with his family in England exposed him to world issues that were to be critically important in his political career. Initially sympathetic to his father's support for appeasement, Jack's views gradually evolved. His Harvard thesis was turned into a best-selling book titled Why England Slept. The reference to Winston Churchill's own collection of speeches titled While England Slept could not have been more obvious. 20 years later, Jack Kennedy was president, and the rhetoric of his administration and its pursuit of both containment and détente with the Soviet Union echoed Churchill. New frontier phrases such as, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate," show clear Churchillian inspiration. The proclamation signed by the president fittingly began with a reference to Winston Churchill's American roots. It said, "Whereas Sir Winston Churchill, a son of America, though a subject of Britain, has throughout his life been a firm and steadfast friend of the United States." Kennedy's personal remarks were cast in Churchillian tones. He said, "In the darkest days and darker nights, when Britain stood alone, he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle." President Kennedy concluded, "We mean to honor him, but his acceptance honors us far more. For no statement or proclamation can enrich his name now. The name of Sir Winston Churchill is already legend." Churchill's reply was read by his son Randolph. "I am half American by blood, and the story of my association with your mighty and benevolent nation goes back nearly 90 years. Our comradeship and brotherhood in war were unexampled. We stood together, and because of that, the free world now stands." 8 months later, Winston Churchill wept silently as he watched the television coverage of the assassination and funeral of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The United States was to play a part in Churchill's life on one final occasion in his 91st year. Throughout his life, Winston Churchill challenged illness, danger, and death with an incredible will to live, in the words of Theodore Roosevelt, to be the man in the arena. In the middle of the Blitz, heedless of the danger, he would go to the roof of Downing Street to watch the action in the skies. But the strain of that war did take its toll. In 1944, with victory in sight, but a hard year of fighting still to come, Clementine Churchill was asked by a friend about her plans for the future. She replied, "I never think of after the war. I think Winston will die when it's over. You see, he's 70, and we're putting all we have into it, and it will take all we have." But Clementine was wrong. Her husband was to live for another 2 decades. Old age fell heavily on Winston Churchill. Ambition and power had always fueled his incredible energy, but without these, he inevitably declined. He said to his daughter Diana, quote, "My life is over, but it is not yet ended." The final blow was another stroke on January 15th, 1965. His family gathered at his bedside, expecting the end in a matter of hours. But Churchill's private secretary, Anthony Montague Brown, told them they were wrong. He explained that one morning some years before, Churchill had suddenly turned to him and said, "Today is the 24th of January. It is the day my father died. It is the day I shall die too." Churchill lingered unconscious for 9 more days and passed away, aged 90 years and 1 month, the morning of Sunday, January 24th. His father, Lord Randolph, had died exactly 70 years before. 6 days later, a great state funeral was held at St. Paul's Cathedral, the first for a commoner since the Duke of Wellington in 1852. 25 years before, an iconic photograph of that cathedral rising undamaged above the smoke of German bombs had come to symbolize the resilience and will of Winston Churchill and the British people. Planning for the funeral had begun some years before with occasional input from its subject. The code name was Operation Hope Not. The organizers later reported that one of the problems was that many of the designated pallbearers had to be replaced, even though they were younger than Churchill, because they kept on dying. Churchill's funeral barge moved slowly down the Thames River to his final resting place. As it continued by, the London dock workers dipped their giant cranes in final silent tribute. Winston Churchill always loved music, especially popular songs, and one of his favorites was the great Union anthem from the Civil War, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. He had heard it on New Year's Day in 1942, worshiping with Franklin Roosevelt at historic Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia. They sat in the very pew that had been used by George Washington and Robert E. Lee, both of whom Churchill considered American heroes. Churchill asked that this hymn be played at his funeral, saying it would be a tribute to his American mother, and so it was. That music, on a cold day in January, 56 years ago, was a fitting epitaph for Winston Churchill, a true American hero. Thank you.